Um, Welcome everybody to this Urban Design Group event. As you'll know, there are a number of great events going on with the Urban Design Group, and really glad that you've got the time to join this one today. Now, logistics is one of those words that nobody used really, unless you were in the army, I think, until a few years ago, and particularly until March last year, when suddenly logistics became a really important thing that started defining how our lives were operating through the pandemic. It's still, to most people, it probably, oh, well, that's what covers the delivery of my food, the delivery of parcels, etc., etc. However, logistics is becoming a science in itself. People are looking at it in really new ways. How can we improve the way in which infrastructure and logistics are performing to make our cities better places and to make our lives better? So I'm going to welcome a bunch of people to present things to you today. And we will start with Robert Huxford, the director of the Urban Design Group, who's going to give an overview of logistics as they are and as they could be. And there'll be a bit of time for questions after that, following which we have Chris Douglas from WSP and Ian Brooker from Jacobs, who are going to talk about how logistics can revolutionise the way we design towns and streets. I like that word, revolutionise. So, wait with bated breath. What are they going to tell us? And there'll be some time for questions after that. Then following that, we have Hannah Smart from Edge Urban Design and Gary Young, Place 54 Architects, who are going to talk about the logistics that support modern life. And also we have another person, we have David Milner from Create Streets, who's looking at very specific challenges around bin lorries, those nightmare things that we all have to make a lot of room for in our master plans. And David will join the rest of the presenters in a panel discussion at the end of all the presentations. So you'll be able to question him as well, even though he's not giving a presentation. He will be here to answer questions and discuss the contribution that bin lorries make to the happiness of our lives on this planet. So, first of all, I'd like to invite Robert to start and do his presentation.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I thought I'd give I think probably an unconventional and rather wide-ranging presentation, because the thing about logistics is it tends to bleed from one set of infrastructure to another, and I'll explain that as we go on. But also, it's the fundamental link between logistics and the shape of our towns and cities and development patterns in general. So first of all, the link between land use and logistics, and I'm going to take this example from Scotland. Here, medieval period. On the right-hand side, there's a contemporary land class map, the quality of land, and you can see that the royal boroughs are focused on the best quality land. And this is really the starting point of the development of an infrastructure system. It's where the people are and where the land is best. So much of the transport in those days, the heavy lifting was by sea, and it said that the majority of cities are at the heads of tidal estuaries, and it's for obvious reasons. You can transport a lot of stuff quite easily by sea, whereas in the pre-industrial period, inland transport is very, very difficult and energy intensive, whereas sea power, sail, it's really free energy. And significant amounts of weight could be carried. So I think that's a cog that was excavated in Newport and compared with a couple of ISO shipping containers. Trading links develop and cultures develop around that. That's a wind chart, and you can see the prevailing high-speed winds tend to be from the southwest and the western quarter. England and Scotland and the British Isles act as a huge breakwater, giving an area of relatively calm, safe water to travel on. So that predisposes the east coast of the British Isles to develop really good trading links with continental Europe. And you can see in some areas architectural styles being picked up. So step gables, these pan tiles. But that's just a bit of a detail. And what we're talking about is fundamentals. And what were we trading in that area? Wool, hide, salt. We're importing wood, iron, wine. 1600s to 1800s, shipping is becoming increasingly large scale, and a far larger range of goods are being traded and imported. And it brings the Western ports into importance. Shipping is getting bigger. And as ships get larger, we need larger port facilities. And that means that when we come to the age of containerisation and the really large container vessels, such as the Maersk E-class, only a few ports in the British Isles can actually handle this size of vessel. In turn, that creates jobs for the repurposing of existing old port facilities. And the regeneration of docklands in London has been going on for, 40, 50 years now. This is hugely significant. The cost of global transport using these container vessels is negligible in comparison with the cost of inland transport. And it means that, in effect, a low-cost factory in, say, Indonesia, where people are being paid next to nothing, is in direct competition with a factory that might be in the centre of the West Midlands. It's hugely important to get this, the impact that this container system has on our economy and our development patterns. So the ISO shipping container is key to this, and it's got dimensions, it's got set dimensions, and it has to be taken around on vehicles, which also are given set dimensions. They're covered in the construction and use regulations. This in turn translated into highway design standards. And we've got a huge and varied tradition in the way we've designed urban areas, from the medieval period into the 1830s onwards, where public health predominated. But in the 19th century, we started to design around vehicles. And from about the 1950s onwards, we were designing around large vehicles. And there you see a council four-axle bin lorry attempting to make a turn, and probably not very successfully. From roads in urban areas, 1966, these are tracking and swept path diagrams. The top one, an articulated vehicle. And the consequence then is we start to have an environment that is designed for large vehicles and not for people. And this was something that was picked up in Manual for Streets and in Scotland Designing Streets. Manual for Streets published in 2007. But this diagram, reproduced in Manual for Streets, is actually from the Devon County Council Traffic Calming Guidelines, written by Tim Farrow, published in 1991. It's the 30th anniversary. And it points out the problems that are caused by this vehicle-centric approach to design. It's fine, maybe if you're an able-bodied person, you're fully sighted, getting across these side road entrances. But if you're an elderly person or a partially sighted person, you've got difficulties. There's very little in street design guidance published about the speed at which people walk. Blind people, elderly people, walk on average below 1 meter per second. So what is for if there's maybe a 15-meter radius curve, corner entrance, for an able-bodied person, it's just a few seconds in the carriageway. For an elderly person, we could be talking 15 or 20 seconds when they're actually in the carriageway and exposed to the risk of oncoming traffic. So the highway adoption standards are a recent development here. It seems innocuous enough, but when you overlay the various dimensions that are stipulated, and these are dimensions that relate to vehicle use, one can see how the design is dictated by the needs of large vehicles and faster moving vehicles rather than by the needs of people. tracking in swept paths, a different approach was advanced in, I think this is a diagram from Better Streets, Better Places, and that was then picked up in Manual for Streets. But it's saying that you set the buildings out to create quality of place, a sense of place. You reinforce that with the curb line, and it's only then that you start to apply, check the design of the street for tracking for movement. Not the other way around. You don't start off with the vehicle being as the basis of design. Waste is another critical factor. And picking up the systems approach, before the Clean Air Acts, a lot of waste would go up the chimney. If you've got your Amazon, assuming Amazon had been operating in the 1950s, your Amazon boxes, you could just burn them on the fire. Now, they have to be taken away. There are loads of different sizes of bins, and they tend to get left on the street. And here are some examples from Edinburgh. We're talking about some of the finest urban landscapes in the country, or some would argue in the world, but they are augmented by these standard wheelie bins. The systems have impacts. They put blind and partially sighted people at a substantial disadvantage, and it's questionable whether these systems are actually lawful under the public sector equality duty. There are alternatives. There are underground container systems, but these require an approach to the way we design our towns and cities that involves the civilized and intelligent management of underground spaces. There are vacuum systems that can be employed as well. And vacuum systems can also be used for deliveries. You'll have been into supermarkets and you'll have seen the pneumatic systems that are used to move cash around the shop. Waste collection vehicles. This rose from a recent consultation on, I think, Oxfordshire County Council's street design standards. So it's saying swept path tracking diagrams needed for parking refuse vehicles. It's specifying what the sizes are. Whereas perhaps the starting point should be disabled people, the people with protected characteristics under the Equality Act, the user hierarchy that's listed in Manual for Streets. There's BS 5906, and it says here that turning places, if required, should be provided for the largest vehicle likely to be used now and in the future. Well, you know, vehicles could get really big. This is the Heil PowerTrack Plus, and I think it comes in at over 60 tons. It's got loads of wheels. But you know, if we move to this sort of system, people will be progressively marginalized. We need streets for people. Waste collection is a service. It's a hugely important service, but it's still a service. It's not the overweening design imperative. And there's nothing in the legal landscape for streets that says that we should design our streets for the largest vehicles ever to be encountered. Maybe the better approach is to design the vehicles around the streets that have first been designed around people. And you can have things like steering rear axles, you can have smaller vehicles. And here is a, maybe it's not an ideal example, but it's a smaller size refuse collection vehicle with a steering rear axle. A bin lorry has a life of 12 years, maybe, before it gets scrapped. Whereas once you have a street in place, well, we know our oldest streets, they go back to the Roman era. I think it's Rochester High Street, first use of the word street in the English language, dating back to about 604 AD. We need a four-dimensional approach to the management and maintenance and operation and the design of urban areas. It's 3 dimensions, up, down, and sideways, and it's 4 dimensions, thinking about time. So an engraving of the Marylebone Road here, and that's what it's like now. the way we design in utilities, and utilities are all part and parcel of the overall logistics system. They're about supplying things. And if water couldn't be supplied in pipes, it would have to be supplied in lorries. And we know when the water main system fails, then it is supplied in lorries. 1946, 1966, the current system, it's just evolved. There's been no reconsideration as to whether this is the best way of doing things. And the consequence is, well, there are lost opportunities. Water recycling, district heating and cooling. These are big pipes. They need to be squeezed in. Tree planting, a hugely important topic here, especially if we are to local authorities to discharge the duty to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And there's plenty of guidance published by the Trees and Design Action Group. There's the issue about tackling flooding. And we seem to be going through a rather intense period of rainfall at the moment. And this is a rainstorm that dropped over 4 inches of rain in the Bracknell area. Under those circumstances, a lot of things are going to flood. And that's why we need to start designing around these things. And it's not just one subject, it's all of the things that need to be taken into consideration. We've got the issue about switching to electricity and the need to upgrade the electricity network. So in summary, what should be done? We need a competent systems-based approach to the design and management and operation of urban areas. We need to discharge statutory duties, but it's discharging all the statutory duties, not just one statutory duties. It's not a monomania, a blinkered, siloed monomania that focuses on just one aspect of human life that matters. It's all of these things. We should be following best practice in all areas, not just one area. And bear in mind the Wednesbury test, the basis for judicial review. One of the tests is that whether things have been taken into consideration that should have been taken into consideration. And that really is a requirement to make balanced decision making, considering all of the relevant factors and using that consideration robustly to determine what is then done in terms of design, management, and operation of urban areas. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks a lot, Robert. That's really great, as ever. Now, has anyone got any questions they'd like to ask Robert before we move on to the next session? I think if you do the hand raising thing, then I can see whether you have a question. Can't see any at the moment. Think about it and I shall ask a question. Robert, very interesting that you identify the challenges for disabled people, particularly partially sighted or blind. Do you know if there have ever been any legal challenges, particularly from the disability sector, towards the legality of how we dump bins and rubbish bags, etc., all over the pavement?
I'm not aware of any. I mean, there has been a precedent in relation to the policies adopted by a council on tactile paving, and that's Arley versus Newham, a case which I think was heard in 2010 at the appeal court. I'm not aware of the waste management issue. I think this is something that should and waits to be tackled.
Brilliant. Well, we might need to prod some of our colleagues. Did I hear someone else having something to contribute there? No? Well, in that case, if they're ready, if we can move on to Chris and Ian's presentation. I'm not sure which of you is screen sharing. Here we go. Excellent.
Hi there. Thanks very much for that. Can everyone hear me? Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Great, good. Okay, yeah, thank you very much for that, and thanks for the interesting introduction as well. I should say before we start that, contrary to what it says on the slide, there isn't a company called Jacobs WSP yet. But, Chris and I work for different companies, but we collaborate together quite often, and in particular, we're presenting something which came up at the recent Urban Challenge event organised by Urban Design London. So if you go to the first slide. The first part of the presentation, I will give some background into the challenges faced for urban logistics and some of the recent history in terms of planning for urban logistics. And then the second half of the presentation, Chris will present one of a suite of tools that we think could be particularly useful, and its time may well have come. So the city challenges are things which I'm sure you're all very familiar with and struggle against and work through every day. There are challenges for air quality, safety of our streets, the challenge of the future of retail and how our high streets are going to look in the future, the challenge of congestion, which even though traffic isn't growing, congestion in London, for example, tends to get worse because roadworks and reallocation of street place and so on. The challenge to provide to make cities more livable, as with the presentation we've just had, a lot of it is about reallocating space so that cities are more friendly for people and bicycles and so on. What are the future economies of cities going to look like? In terms of London at the moment, again, it could look quite challenging because of the severe drop in the office economy, with more and more people working at home. What impact will that have on the very centres, the hearts of our cities? Resilience to things like COVID, obviously, and to other challenges, climate change, and so on. The challenge of welcoming diversity and serving diverse communities, dealing with poverty, which is still seriously embedded in most of our major cities, providing housing and providing green space. So those are just some of the examples. If you look across at the at logistics, at the people who are doing deliveries and bringing in the goods that cities depend on, and taking away the waste that all cities generate, they have a very similar set of challenges. So there's a real challenge at the moment to meet a target for zero emissions. There's a national target to eliminate diesel from road haulage vehicles. I think it's by 2050. But there's also local challenges for zero emission zones, and we should be moving as quickly as we can towards zero emission town centres and city centres. We also are aiming towards zero injuries. Collisions between goods vehicles and vulnerable users, cyclists and pedestrians, account for a very large proportion of serious injuries and deaths on roads. And that's been a major focus of policy in London in particular over the last 10 years. I know they contribute to it, but they also suffer greatly from it as well. Pedestrianisation is a challenge for logistics companies because they continue to want to make deliveries to high streets and to stores and to people's houses. Pedestrianisation cycle lanes can make that very, very challenging, but if it's planned well, it shouldn't be an obstacle. The changing role of the high street, so moving perhaps away from major stores and perhaps more towards an event and experience-based location with restaurants and cafes and community facilities and so on. As well as, it's tempting to think of all deliveries in the future being small consignments to our houses, ordered through Amazon. But still, cities need to change and regenerate and continue to grow. And to do that, they need construction materials, but not just for building things, but also for refurbishing things. So I live in a relatively new block of housing in Crawley. Ever since the apartments near us were finished 10 years ago, there have been issues with the windows and the exteriors and the roofs. That means scaffolding lorries coming in all the time, cherry pickers. There's also people to do with landscaping. And of course, people want things delivered like sofas and beds and so on. So not everything can be delivered by a bicycle or even a lightweight electric van. And so as well as waste, you need to keep access somehow for the things which make people's lives easier. The apartments near where I live, which is about 80% of the development, they have no provision for deliveries at all. And so anybody that's even delivering a sofa risks, if they get there at the same time as the people who are doing the parking fines, they risk having a parking fine slapped on them. And that makes their lives very difficult, because when they ring up for a service, but when they hear where they live, they get turned down a lot or charged extra. Same day, same hour. So we don't just want things to be delivered tomorrow. We want them delivered today. And in London, increasingly, it's within the next hour. Lack of industrial space. That's important, because logistics is classified as industry. And a lot of the industrial space in cities, particularly London, has in the past been sold off for housing. And then logistics companies have to deal with truck bans. There are night bans in some areas and day bans in others, weight bans in some areas and emissions-based bans in other areas. So you can see that the challenge for logistics is very difficult as well. I'll go to the next slide. Post-COVID, or during COVID, the changes which we've all been able to see have accelerated dramatically. So e-commerce grew by 50% in a matter of months. That meant huge changes to supply chains. And in particular, logistics companies were grabbing major warehouses as fast as they could possibly build them. So the uptake of big sheds, as we call them, anything up to 2.5 million square feet, it has been dramatic. And in itself, that is forcing a certain kind of distribution system on us, regardless of what we might like to plan or otherwise. But also, if you work from home, as most of us do from time to time, or over quite a long time, if you sit near the window, you will see for your street multiple deliveries every day. Not just multiple companies, but each company making several deliveries every day. It's pretty anarchic in some ways. Right, we'll go on to the next one. So TfL saw a lot of this happening, and I think there were two things which were catalysts for change within Transport for London. One was the London Olympics, where there was a realization that there was a real possibility that for large parts of London, deliveries would not be possible during the daytime during the Olympics. And a huge amount of work was done extremely successfully to work with businesses to change the way they had their deliveries. That meant a move towards nighttime deliveries, but also to different kinds of vehicles and to different ways of planning deliveries, and that was extremely successful. At the same time, there was a crisis in terms of the fatalities for cyclists caused by heavy goods vehicles, and so those two things led to TfL spending a lot of time and quite a lot of money on setting up a whole structure of ways to work better with industry in order to improve deliveries and to minimise the impacts of logistics, and also, quite frankly, to understand what logistics is all about. Because as an authority primarily concerned with moving people and tubes and buses and trains, TfL didn't really understand what was going on. Three results of that were some very groundbreaking and very important tools. There was the delivery and service plans, which is a way of businesses planning how they receive deliveries. There's the freight operator recognition scheme, which is what you might see in London or across the country, with stickers on the back of lorries saying that the operator complies to a certain set of standards, which are particularly focused on the interface with communities and the environment. And then also, probably more in the background, but there's the Construction Logistics Improvement Group and the Construction Logistics Safety Group, which are very much focused on construction logistics, which accounts for quite a high percentage of heavy goods vehicles in central London, and an extremely high percentage of interactions between cycles and pedestrians and goods vehicles. Oops. Pop up this part of where I was reading right here. I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of that initiative has dissipated a bit. So construction logistics bans continue, freight operator recognition continues and goes from strength to strength. Delivery and service plans, really, people only do those if it's specified in a planning application. It's actually something I think that all businesses should do as a matter of routine. If we go on to the next one. Meanwhile, the world has moved on. As well as Transport for London, a lot of work was done by the European Union in particular through various of the European research programs and quangos. Again, a vast amount of resources are put into understanding the issues of urban logistics, and as a result, there's a growing toolkit of of resources that cities can use to better plan for logistics and to implement a completely different way of looking at deliveries. So it's pretty much accepted that last mile deliveries in cities and towns should increasingly and by some point all be done using zero emission impact vehicles, which could include freight bicycles or even porters. All of these things require a combination of carrot and stick. So it needs both restrictions, but also working with industries to understand how those restrictions affect their businesses. But still, we shouldn't be implying that means you have a second-class logistics service. Deliveries should still arrive when needed. And some of these solutions, such as consolidation centres, enable businesses to thrive by freeing up storage space, for example, so that shops can have more space to get devoted to their customers on the front, in the front of shop, but also small businesses can start up in homes without having to worry about where they're going to hold stock, because it can be a nearby community facility. Okay, we'll go on to the next one. I personally think that the lead in Europe has really been taken by Paris. And that has been for some time, actually. They've had 3 series of charters, which are really worthwhile documents to look up, because they're not just a commitment to doing something good. They've actually got, each of them has got projects which are committed to by the signatories, and the signatories include the major distribution companies and retailers and so on in Paris, as well as the local authorities and the highway authorities. Paris has thought carefully about the interface between carrot and stick, so that increasingly there are restrictions on deliveries that you can make into the centre of Paris. But as a result of that, they recognise that that means that you need to transfer goods from a bigger vehicle to a smaller vehicle at some point. And sometimes you even have to do that twice. So it's almost 2 levels of consolidation centres. So it could be a railway vehicle into a larger truck, and then a truck to another consolidation centre where the final delivery is done by bicycle or an e-bike. And the Paris approach has a very strong link between land use planning and logistics planning. So it's not seen as a transport issue per se, it's seen as a citywide issue. We'll go on to the next page to see some examples. There's 2 examples here. The bottom 2 on the left and bottom centre is a development called La Chapelle, which is just north of Gare du Nord, just inside the Boulevard Périphérique. And the distribution centre is actually underneath the green area there in the slide, which is an urban farm on the roof, which is a very sort of Parisian thing, but I think it makes the point. Inside, on one floor in the basement, there's like a warehouse, which is currently used by a huge retail catering cash and carry company. And on the floor above is actually a rail terminal within the building. But alongside the building, there is just a normal city centre property development of flats and apartments and so on. So it just shows how mixed use, even for something which you consider to be quite intrusive, like a rail terminal, is possible. At the other end of the scale, the other 2 pictures, which look like a fairly standard small distribution centre, are notably in a multi-storey car park. Now, multi-storey car parks are interesting things in cities because hopefully we'll be needing less and less of them, and that releases space for other things. Visited this development in Paris, have recognised this opportunity and have identified a series of car park spaces which they are one by one letting out for distribution companies. And the idea is that you have larger electric vehicles doing deliveries into the facility, and then smaller electric vehicles doing the daily deliveries out to households and neighbours. And there's another example on the next page, which you can see in London, which is near Victoria, which is DBD's showpiece distribution facility, but they're actually opening a whole series of those across London. And the notable thing about that is that freight is transferred outside the M25 into medium-sized electrically powered lorries, and then at night those lorries come into the distribution centre, unload their goods, and then during the day, so I think the one at the back is the delivery lorry, and the 2 in the front are the distribution vehicles. The one that looks like a golf cart is a kind of electric distribution vehicle, I think it's unique to DPD, but it's an interesting example of something which could potentially go along pavements and so on, and deliver right up to the doorstep. Let's go on the next page. Okay, so I think I hope you've got the impression that there are exciting things happening in logistics to deal with the challenges of making cities more livable and making cities and dealing with the changes of our needs in terms of where we buy stuff and how we want it delivered. Chris is going to present just one idea of a way of actually making that happen on the ground.
Thanks, Ian. Hello, everybody. As Ian said, he and I, over quite a long period of time, collaborated on a lot of freight project work. So we're both logistics specialists, and we'd like to talk you through an idea that we have, which we've been working up, which was fairly well received through the Urban Design London work that Ian mentioned. So could I just have the next slide, please? So the idea that we have, and this is very much linked into just explain a little bit about the DPD example that Ian gave previously. That essentially is within what we would call a closed network. So that's specifically for DPD running its operation and carrying out its last mile and first mile activity. I think the idea that we have is very much linked to bringing clean logistics right into the central urban area, adjacent to communities and local businesses. So for many years, as you know, logistics and distribution activity has been based on the edge of town, out of town, and generates in many cases, long stem mileages in diesel vehicles to deliver into central urban areas. What we need to do, we think, especially when you take a look at the changing role of the high street, the growth in online retail, and the massive increase in van registration. So light goods vehicles, vans, essentially, if you look at the figures for registrations between 2009 and 2021, they've increased by 70% over the course of what is essentially 12 years. So that gives an indication of just the sheer volume of activity that I guess we all see on the roads and probably generate the trips for ourselves when we buy stuff online. And we need to do something about that. A lot of the time people jump to the conclusion that maybe e-cargo bikes are the right solution. I think the image on the left-hand side of that slide, which is a company called PedalMe, which is one of the zero-emission delivery service operators, of which there are plenty, developing and growing across the country. So that's a pretty well-stacked e-cargo bike with a homemade trailer behind it and a driver who's probably got the biggest calf, or a rider who's probably got the biggest calf muscles of any person you've ever met, because it's pretty significant, even though there is e-assist on that type of vehicle. I think what we need to do is understand that the solution isn't one-dimensional. It's about bringing together various component parts of urban freight management package, of which we think a community hub would bring logistics activity, clean logistics activity, so zero emission, use of e-cargo bike, electric buggy, foot porterage, e-van, right smack bang into the center of the urban area, so that it becomes less based on the edge of town, out of town, and somewhere really where the community can actively engage, bring goods in, drop items off, collect their consignments rather than relying on home delivery for that last mile movement. The site or sites wouldn't necessarily be based in just single locations. It could be out in the suburbs as well as the adjacent to major retail areas, and would be fed through a network of consolidation centres and distribution centres using clean vehicles for the feeder service. I think the idea would also be that there would be storage on site to enable home workers to have stock of whatever it is that they need to use on a daily basis, as well as supporting the local business community. And the idea is very much about making it logistics-centric development, so that it becomes a little bit like the old post offices used to be back in the day, but actually using a clean alternative so that it helps to meet environmental performance improvement and also safe to reduce conflict with vulnerable road users. Can I have the next slide, please? What are the benefits? Well, one of the things that we've seen in work that we do quite closely with operators, DPD, which we'll come back to, and also Zedify that I mentioned. So DPD this year in January had their highest ever volume of delivery activity through their network in one night. So it was 2 million items moved through a DPD network in January of this year in one evening. Zedify, on the other hand, one of the cargo bike operators, moved 1 million consignments last year. So over the course of 12 months, and that kind of gives you a bit of an idea in terms of just the scale of traffic that we're all generating as consumers and that businesses generate as well. I think it's worth maybe just reflecting a little bit in terms of business to business movement and also business to consumer movement. So historically, DPD would have had 60% of their traffic moving business to business and 40% of the traffic through their network being delivered to residential consumer properties. That over the last 18 months has changed, and particularly over the last 12 months has changed very significantly, with about 3 years worth of volume growth in the space of 1 year. But what's really important is that the shift has occurred so that it's predominantly business to consumer, 60%, and 40% business to business. Why is that important? Well, delivering business to business is easier than business to consumer in many ways, because you deliver at a time where the goods can be received and you're guaranteed pretty much that somebody's going to be on site. When you shift to a business to consumer model, the question is whether or not that person's at home at that time. Obviously, that's been the case predominantly during COVID period. But what happens if that sticks? And because the biggest killer in terms of efficiency within the likes of a DPD network is failed delivery attempts, where they try to deliver to premises, but there's nobody in to receive it, and there's no suitable alternative place to leave the consignment. That means that consignment has to come back onto the vehicle and goes through the network or goes back to the depot for redelivery attempt either later in the day or the following day. So the idea of having something, a logistics center, clean logistics center based adjacent to high level of residential area and also the local business community, helps to reduce the risk of those failed delivery attempts and repeat activity, which is concept of minimizing trips per consignment. There's the opportunity to then fully net zero carbon that last mile and also the first mile, because sometimes reverse flows are forgotten when we talk about logistics. We always think about the inbound movement and the delivery, but it's also about the collection and the outbound movement of consignments as well, which then help to balance the flows. There's the opportunity of this kind of logistics-centric development to be a local logistics service for small businesses. So instead of just last mile and first mile, the other term that we talk about is the only mile. So that would be from a local supplier to a local customer, from a local business to another local business, or a local business to local community. And we've seen that become ever more prevalent. And we've also seen it in some of the work that local authorities, the local boroughs have done during the COVID period, where they have set up e-cargo bike services themselves, funded them for collection of consignments from local businesses to deliver out to isolated or remote residents or mobility impaired residents, to make sure that they're not isolated during that period. What it also means is that there is a hub where fewer separate delivery services potentially could be created, or the total number reduced, so that there is a single focal point for that activity. It can become part of the local community rather than being seen as a, dirty, offensive visitor to the area. It can be seen as an integral part of that local community, and that's a really important thing in terms of understanding the psyche and of the public in terms of how they see delivery services these days. Having something that is promoted as clean, reasonably priced, and efficient, that is able to deliver or collect consignments at the time when the local community and local business need it is crucial, I think. Next slide, please. So where we've seen good examples of sort of local micro distribution sites, or what some of the carriers call urban depots, in a high street unit, so either unused or underutilized premises or peripheral building, and that's both private estate and also in the public sector estate. Ian mentioned about DPD and the approach that they take to try to find urban depots up and down the country, and that's very much the case. Repurposing car parks is one real opportunity, particularly proven by an example that Transport for London put out a market sounding questionnaire at the end of last year, looking at potential interest in repurposing station car parks, 79 of them within Greater London area. And there was a real interest and a real demand for those sites from parcel carriers, because they see them as an opportunity to set up a small operation that has a good 2 or 3 mile radius catchment area, quite sensitive to local amenity, and also becomes easy access to a high level of population density and also local businesses. So clever use of existing infrastructure apart from the private and public sector estate, I think is really important. It could be operated by a local franchisee or a national operator who's got the right ethos. A decade ago, we probably wouldn't have been able to entertain the idea of e-cargo bike use within sort of blue chip networks like DPD or DHL, whatever. But they were very often seen as kind of something that happens on the continent and in a research and demonstration project scenario rather than real life urban logistics. That's changed definitely, and I think the thinking has changed within the industry. And I think also as consumers, we're starting to think a little bit differently. Where do we really need to order a book in the morning and get it delivered in the evening? Can't we choose something that's a more that is much more beneficial from an environmental point of view and from a consolidated trip point of view? So we think that there is relevance to suburban centres as well as city centres, because they make these sites something that's absolutely integral part of the local community. It is possible there at the same site, as well as having an operator who will deliver and collect for you, there is the opportunity from a local business point of view to have an open access shared resource in terms of e-cargo bike. So trying to encourage local businesses to use their own, particularly on the only mile bit that I mentioned, from a trip generated within the local area, from a local business to a local consumer or to another business customer, and to use e-cargo bike to be able to do that, which could be done themselves or by hiring a rider. There may be a need for a new approach to planning designation, because obviously what we're talking about is high street units previously used for retail, now being used for a different purpose. And I think it needs to demonstrate a project rather than simply putting it out to tender. I think it's about collaboration between the public sector and the private sector on this. And I think it's local authorities, London boroughs working together with industry operators and local communities to understand exactly what it is that they need and figure out how those would work in practice. Next slide, please. As Ian said, the likes of DPD and Amazon and others already do this. Corner shops also act as parcel collection and drop-off points. But I'm sure we can say ourselves that there's a real risk of development not really servicing local needs, and so the national networks serving solely their own closed networks is something very different to what we're talking about here. We're talking about something which would be a logistics-centric development within local communities, so that it gets embedded and used by local residents and local businesses. Next slide, please. So, final slide from me. I think what we need to do to take this forward is find an enthusiastic and supportive local authority, put together a consortium of the right sort of collaboration partners, identify the right location or locations for multiple sites within a local area and understand what the needs are, specify the service, appoint an operator and work in partnership with them, and ultimately see if we can demonstrate how this works at a local community level, both residents and businesses. Last slide. So I think Ian and I would be really interested in any questions that you've got, anything that we can explain in more detail about what we presented. And also, if you think this is of interest moving forward, then please get in touch. It is a joint project that Ian and I together as WSP and Jacobs are very keen to work up with collaboration partners. So happy to take your questions and also have discussion offline if you think it's something that you'd be interested in getting involved in. Thanks.
Great. That's really interesting. Many thanks, Chris and Ian. You didn't mention, the interesting thing to me was you didn't mention the post office in amongst all this, because historically the post office has probably been our logistics community hub in many ways, and for small villages in particular that still have post offices, that's an existing function. So potentially you could see your community logistics hub as a return to expanding those kind of activities. I can see, I think you're absolutely right, a demonstrated project's really important, and in a way they might be more successful in small towns and large villages to start with, and get into high streets as well slowly.
Yeah, I think we did mention, what old post office used to be back in the day, I think we said, but that's okay. I think the key to this is, yeah, you're right. I mean, there is looking backwards in the rearview mirror. Absolutely, that's kind of what they did. I think the genie's out of the lamp in terms of having to have clean solutions in urban areas. So this is as much about focusing on a zero emission service as it is just having the function present within the local communities. It has to be zero emission and net zero carbon from this point onwards. So I think that's the thing that we would try to stress. It's the same concept, but it's a slightly different approach for a more modern day environment.
That's great. Now, there's been quite a bit going on in the chat here, and I don't know if anyone who was posting comments and questions in the chat would like to ask a question or contribute further. Can't see any hands up. There was, particularly in the chat also, there's a link to something happening in Cork City. Would the person who I presume is from Cork who posted that, would they like to contribute a quick description of what's happening in Cork?
Good morning. Good afternoon, Amanda. Can you hear me?
Yes. Oh, it's a poor line. Is that John? Sorry.
It's Martin here in Cork.
Great. If you could just tell us your name and your role, what it is that you do, and explain quickly what you've done in Cork. Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me now again?
Yes, keep talking.
Okay. Well, my own name is Martin Ryan, and I'm a planner in Cork City Council in the Strategic and Economic Development section. But the cargo bikes was an innovation done by our Sustainable Transport Department, and we have a relatively small city. It's flat, and to balance, I suppose, in the last 14 months, a lot of the streets in Cork have been pedestrianised, have been the footpaths have been widened, cycle routes have come in. So all of a sudden we have a restriction and a contraction in relation to the amount of space being able with the vehicles. So if you do that, if you take with one hand, you have to give with another. So the cargo bikes was an innovation that we see it all the time on the continent. And I suppose sometimes in Ireland, we look at UK examples. We don't go beyond to Europe. And this was a very successful. You see this in Europe, and there was an idea, and we decided we'd use the example here. So we've got one bike at the moment, and we're going to be procuring additional bikes. And there's been great support from the Chamber of Commerce, from the Cork business community, and it's all of a sudden bikes are the in thing in the last 12 months, especially since the COVID and the pandemic, and the amount of traffic in our cities has seriously declined, which is great. So it's very much in its infancy, Amanda. So fingers crossed, as I said in my note, small steps.
That's great.
You've got to be seen to be thinking outside the box.
That's brilliant. Thanks a lot for bringing that to our attention. And if anybody wants to look at more details on that, there's a link in the chat now, which is terrific. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks,
now I've got a couple of other questions, and we'll take John Grantham first, and then Sue James second. If you want to, you're on mute. Oh no, thank you. Well done. Oh, sorry, John, your line is dreadful. John, we're not actually able to hear you at all. Can you, maybe if you turn your camera off? Maybe John, while you're trying to sort that out, Sue, could you step in with your question?
Yeah.
Comment?
So I was going to ask. I'm not sure how Chris and Ian got into logistics, but so many decisions are made on so many developments at an early stage. Do you think all the other players involved in any sort of development actually are thinking about logistics at the right time? Just like we can't get people to think about trees at the right time or everything else. Is it a sort of discipline and understanding that should be more embedded in our sort of educational built environment education?
My view is it probably wasn't about enough. There are standards which are applied, and the local authorities will usually look to those standards. For example, to have a certain number of delivery bays if there are shops involved, and of course we've already talked about minimum curves for lorries to come into roads and so on. But we would probably like to see that taken a lot further, and for people, for requirements for every new development to be to develop a delivery and service plan, which is a plan which looks at in detail at what's going to be delivered to a location and how those deliveries are going to be managed. And I think that's the process which gets people thinking about what they should need.
So is that something that needs to be kind of embedded in planning, as requirements automatically?
I think so, as a minimum, yes. I don't think it even is in London. I mean, the construction logistics plan is the most basic one, which is a plan to manage the logistics when you're building the site. But and quite a lot of London boroughs require construction logistics plans to be implemented for every development. But delivery and service plans, I think, is a much rarer beast. For larger developers, we work with the developers and try to get them to think a bit more positively about having a local freight and delivery hub, for example.
Can I sneak in a second quick question? Oh, sorry, Chris.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, all I was going to say, I was just going to just add to what Ian had said, where the delivery and servicing plan concept is really important. And I also think following up on the delivery and service plan, what you declare or what a developer declares in their DSP is really important, because when they put the numbers in, it needs to then bear fruit in terms of what actually happens under business as usual. So that if they say there's going to be X number of vehicle trips, it's not 2X vehicle trips that actually happen in practice. And we've seen the concept of a DSP bond coming up, where the developer would have to lodge a financial bond, which then gets released slowly back whenever business as usual actual trip generation is checked from a delivery and servicing trip point of view.
Can I sneak in just one quick little extra question?
Yes,
do you think we ought to face up and pay properly for this incredible service that people are getting to their doors, or it's unbelievable. Somebody does all your shopping at Waitrose, not mine, but lots of people's, and the whole thing's delivered and paid for, and it's 10 quid. So I saw somebody said, we're doing all this on the basis of very poorly paid people actually out there doing this quite stressful work.
Do you want me to answer that, Ian? Yeah. Yeah, I think, sorry if this sounds a little bit pessimistic, but I think, in many ways, the whole free 24-hour delivery, Amazon Prime, the Ocado Zoom, groceries within an hour and so on. I mean, ultimately, those are just driven by customer service, and the freight industry, logistics industry is a service provider, and it meets the demands from consumers, whether it's private individual residents or whether it's local businesses or whatever. And yeah, I mean, I think it's always harder to go back to what we used to do. I think we need to face up to the fact that, well, this is where we've got to in terms of consumerism. These are what our expectations are these days. We definitely need to encourage people to think differently about purchasing and businesses to think differently about procurement. But I think we also then, can't just sit with our fingers crossed and hope people then, decide, oh, it's better if I, consolidate all of the things that I've ordered online and just get one delivery per week. I think it's very difficult. One anecdote, we did Westminster City Council's freight servicing and delivery strategy last year, 2020 to 2040. And we did a lot of business engagement and some resident engagement. And I spoke to a resident, and this will stick with me for a long time, because they basically said that they thought it was appalling, the massive number of vans that were within Westminster, delivering right the way through from early in the morning till late at night, and they didn't understand, what is it that we need to do to minimise online retail. And in the same breath, they then said that they would like a second cardboard collection from recycling to pick up all of the Amazon boxes that they have stuck at the front door. And it wasn't said with irony. It was actually said, in from a comment from a resident who just didn't make that connection between their purchasing decisions directly linked onto the vehicles on the highway outside their front door.
It's like people sitting in traffic jams moaning about the traffic, but not
That's
recognizing
exactly
that they are the traffic.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Sue. We're going to have another try with John Grantham, and then we're going to move on to the next panel. John, do you want to see if you can make your sound work this time?
Yeah, I think I fixed it. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you. That's good.
Yeah, I am pioneering something that I called community logistics before I even heard of what Chris and Ian are doing. And it was inspired by the Transition Network, who have something called Transition Streets, which are, and they create a network of transition hubs, which are made up of groups of neighbouring households. And with a background in logistics, it occurred to me that the transition hub concept, had a synergy with the logistical efficiency, and so I've sort of trying this idea out in urban Dorset, Bournemouth, Christchurch, and Poole, and I've won some startup funding and interest in developing a community, well, what I've been calling it up to now, a community logistics app, which would make it easy for households to consolidate orders and deliveries. So it's really about community logistics in that it's promoting the local economy. So it's the only mile, the local deliveries really are the primary focus or primary interest. But obviously, so anyway, getting to my question, and so the network that I'm starting up is so the next phase of my project is to recruit a team of hub coordinators who are going to get their neighbours together and form these hubs. And the coordinators will be the pickup point or drop-off point. So I'm trying the idea of using domestic properties as consolidation centres for people's neighbours. And I just wondered if Chris or Ian had considered that as a possibility, and whether, because I'm not aware of anyone that's tried it before, and wonder if you could perhaps foresee any problems with that.
If we could make a brief answer, and because we're now running late for the next panel.
Yeah, from my point of view, that sounds like a brilliant idea. The only thing I've heard of similar is a system, I can't remember the name, which is for retailers to rent out spare space in their back stockroom, for example, to other retailers, and they can accept deliveries on behalf of the other retailers, and so they become like a mini hub. But I hadn't heard it on the residential level. The challenge is probably about paperwork and things which apps can overcome nowadays, and it's a very, very dynamic environment with a lot of interesting new solutions coming along like this.
That's great. Sounds terrific, John. Keep up the good work as well. And now, if I can just remind everybody that if they can all stay on mute when the presentations are going on, I think we're all automatically on that anyway. And I'd now like to introduce Hannah Smart and Gary Young. Hannah from Edge Urban Design and Gary from Place 54 Architects, and they're going to talk more about logistics.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. So Gary and I have worked together for many years and collaborated on lots of projects. And we are also, so we both have our own businesses, and it isn't another merger that we're kind of putting out there. It's not Place 54 living on the edge, but we also do collaborate and work together as part of a team called the London Collective, which brings together lots of different consultants from different backgrounds. So a lot of our thinking has been developed through those partnerships that we've worked together on. So Gary is going to kick off, and then I will come in slightly later on. So after you, Gary.
Thank you. Thanks, Hannah. I'm Gary Young, Director of Place 54 Architects. The image on the first slide is how we're going to talk, Hannah and I, about aspirations and how all the good work that Chris and Ian and Robert have explained can be turned into ideas which we can start to implement in the smallest and largest scales possible. And so we aspire to places which are beautiful, they actually have activity and public realm. And what we want to take you through is a few ideas how mobility hubs interrelate with public realm. So if you go to the next slide. Is it working, Hannah? Yes. So we just set down sort of 5 objectives for mobility hubs, which you have heard the other speakers talk about, but these are really high on our priorities. So using smaller vehicles to enable highway geometry to be tightened up. That gives better streets, safer conditions, pedestrians and cyclists and children can use the outside. Enable zero emission vehicles and encourage active travel, cycling and walking. Then, crucially, integrate more day-to-day participation activities into community lifestyles. And I found as a really good starting point this document by Como UK. So if anyone wants to look this up whilst we're speaking, you can see that there's some very useful diagrams how mobility hubs integrate into public realm. And we're going to describe these in our slides, Hannah and myself, at different scales, from the large to the very smallest scale, but it's well described in that document and very well illustrated as well, which we always find is an inspiring way to begin our work. Thanks. Next slide. And so alongside Ian and Chris, we think that public realm and the provision of services that people want to make their places beautiful is a concept which is not linear. It's not a logistical line, it's a loop. And it requires the loop to consider delivery, return with actions and feedbacks, which we're also familiar with apps and feedbacks, but as people, we tend to ignore the consequences of return actions and the number of times we're using the streets for sort of perhaps unnecessary activities. And it's really important to see that as a whole and to actually influence it both through thinking of clients as the businesses which provide these services, the communities which have to deal with them when they're being provided, for the individuals who really desire and want them. So it's that circular, again, look at business between community and individual. And everything is a vehicle, bikes, trailers and scooters, and even skateboards. We'll come to that at the end. And all packages are packages, whether they're physical or virtual. And that then means that we start to look at smart technology to make sure we all get what we need. And that's from largest to smallest scale. And to achieve the objectives we had on the first slide, we need to reduce the impact of the largest scale, i.e., as Robert exemplified so well, no 40-foot containers navigating street corners. And then our aspiration is the smallest scale becomes the most accessible part for everyday life. And that enables people to act as a community. So next slide. And we started using the sort of Como UK idea of diagrams to build up our own set of diagrams for the different scales of mobility hubs. And so this is just a work in progress, but we wanted to start with how an urban area, which has a lot of residential uses, touches up against an area which has logistics at its heart, which is more accessible from the strategic network. So we think there's a series of scales of these mobility hubs. And one of them would be a consolidation and distribution hub, which for an urban area deals with the sort of movement of large vehicles, and most importantly deals with recycling as well as distribution. So those are all brought into the same concept. And then there's an idea which I'm very familiar with, having worked on logistics, is the breakdown of scale. So a hub should then break down into smaller components of delivery, from larger vehicles to small electric vans, from electric vans to cargo bikes and electric bikes, and any form of smaller scale delivery. And the idea of this would be that, as people have referenced, the community concierge, which historically would have been a post office or something, would become part of the place that creates this network of distribution. So that would include waste consolidation, deciding when and what energy can be generated from waste, as well as recycling. And it would also become a place where all of the zero emission delivery vehicles could be used, rented, exchanged, including bikes, cargo bikes, and there would be charging points for such vehicles. So the next slide. And then the next slide is actually looking at the sort of way that the community interfaces with this, because there is a need for, we believe, in a 15-minute walkable neighborhood, understanding that there's an interrelationship between this larger scale hub and the smaller scale hubs. And the smaller scale hubs could be managed by a porter, a concierge, who actually understands how to deal with failed deliveries and give feedback, and inform and enable, a person to speak to. So it's not just all online. And deliveries would be to all types of buildings, homes, businesses. But then we begin to bring in drop boxes, which are shared facilities where you can store stuff if you can't pick it up immediately, and such that Amazon now do, but it should be a community related activity alongside where cycling can be integrated into the streets, and bringing in all forms of collaborative, digital and collective inclusive activities, so that the streets become the place that people can use for play and activities that are shared. So I'm going to hand over to Hannah, who's going to take these ideas and explain them in more detail, and then we'll come back and summarize at the end. Next slide.
So I think we're just going to zoom out slightly, and I just wanted to include what some people tend to think about when we talk about distribution and hubs, and it's an infrastructure, and it's that kind of really big scale commercial type buildings that obviously don't integrate with placemaking very well. And part of our challenge is to look at how we can design into that and make sure that it's a completely different solution that doesn't give us streets that are full of lorries, etc., as we've discussed. So the traditional view of these type of buildings is a very large industrial building, but people are starting to look at how those can be designed slightly differently. For example, running design competitions to improve the appearance and aesthetics of these types of buildings, but we don't think these are the solution. So moving away from those and going back to the concept that Gary has just described, we are using the projects that we're working on currently to start to explore how this can actually happen on the ground and how we can make the first steps. I think actually it's been a really good conversation listening to everybody else on the panel and the kind of theories behind these ideas. And actually, I think we're quite excited to try and get this moving in a specific project example. So as Gary talked about, it's, you may think that a kind of distribution hub is a big area that is one building associated with lots of traffic and infrastructure, but actually it could be disaggregated, as Gary discussed. So there's nothing to say that there couldn't be lots of smaller elements, be it a smart lamppost or a cargo bike or a locker or somebody's house where they're looking after parcels. There could be so many parts of this as a concept that we can start to integrate into places. So we've started to explore this, and thanks very much it was Martin Ryan, wasn't it, who introduced the cargo bike. So I've quickly sneaked that one in there. But there are so many different ways that we could start to disaggregate this, and kind of understanding that the sum of all these parts, which is greater and how does it work, and how do we start to design streets to make sure that we can firstly react to change, because it's not to say that we only need to design new streets, but we can also look at retrofitting existing streets and cities and towns and villages, and integrating distribution and movement in that way. So we are actually working currently on a new settlement. Gary and I are working together as part of the London Collective, and taking those ideas of what different parts of a hub or distribution hub or movement hub could be. We've started to look at how we can integrate those into the fabric of a new place. This is a settlement of 6,500 houses in a rural context, and we're really starting to tackle now, what does it actually mean to have a hub? What are people's perceptions when we put these circles on a drawing, and what do they mean? Are they a big warehouse, or how do we start to tell the story that actually they don't have to be, that they could be a cycling cafe or a smart lamppost or a smart bike rack, or there could be so many different elements, and therefore how does that start to change how, as urban designers and master planners, we approach placemaking? So really, really exciting, and I think it's been great to hear everybody else's thoughts on this, which of course will evolve our thinking too. So for us, it's not about one thing, but it's about using this opportunity to create lots of different approaches to connectivity, mobility and hubs, and how that all kind of works together, but also changes people's perception about the way in which they live. So we've been asking ourselves the question of who would live in a settlement that has this kind of very exciting, great infrastructure set behind it, and how do people interact with that and create change in their current day-to-day lives. So actually the pandemic from that point of view has been a really exciting way of looking at how we can make changes and improve the way that we look at placemaking. But also, I think I did touch on it earlier, it's not just about new places, and we are really excited to look at how we could potentially interact with existing towns and cities and start to integrate that and retrofit it. So Gary and I have had a quick think about taking Huxford, which is a place that both of us know really well, and how we could retrofit that. And Gary, do you want to jump in and add to that?
Yes, so this is an area which we just chose as a case study to take further in the sort of north side of Oxford's High Street along Cornmarket and George Street, Broad Street, where it contains the covered market. It includes several of the colleges, and it has some private and commercial retail space. And there's a whole interaction there between existing sort of Deliveroo bikes all sort of stacked up in George Street Mews and around St. George's Place, where organisation of this will assist the sort of local residents, but will also enable the restaurants to thrive. The covered market could easily accommodate this type of hub, and it's owned by the city council. So we'd like to think that there could be a partnership between commercial companies and the city council and the universities. And on the Cornmarket, there's a proposed new retail development at the Clarendon Centre, which is a great opportunity to bring, and their intention is to take a covered mall and open it as a public realm space between the blocks. But there's already existing delivery areas to, I think it's an Aldi or and there's it's an Argos, but there's a possibility that they could then integrate a hub for cycle cargo bikes into their delivery yard and begin to build a partnership between the city council and private sector to improve and make these streets work without a sort of plethora of vans and large vehicles. So we're quite excited, and we'd like to push this a little bit further along the line. It's all been done voluntarily at the moment, but we can see an opportunity to engage with different partners in this type of thing. Next slide. And I also think, just to sum up, there's much wider opportunities than streets and urban places, because Hannah and I together have collaborated on many things, including growing food and activities such as planting and sport and recreation. And the slide at the top, the picture at the top is my mobility hub, which is a trailer I bought for my bike, because I run a junior cricket club in Regent's Park. And this has transformed my summer, or spring and summer, because the hub store was shut. So how do I get cricket kit for 40 children onto the park? The trailer is actually, everybody's looking around Regent's Park now thinking, oh, this trailer is a fantastic idea. So it's about inspiring. And I also use it to help people move plants to their planting in their window boxes. And alongside this is a wider concept that Hannah and I collaborated on. This was on the right-hand side is Market Garden City, which is a poster we produced for one of the Urban Design Group festivals. And it's about involving people in their own choices in terms of food production and growing. And this really revolves around hubs, which were markets in historic towns, but can be dealt with at a series of scales, from a town market to a small street market. And it's where people collaborate, they work together, they share food, and you avoid waste, and you create this sort of containment of activity where at the smaller scale people participate. And using smart tech, this will go wider and wider and wider, and with young people being interested in all this, we think it's a great potential. So the final slide is one we've just thrown in. I think it's there, Hannah. So yeah, this is the mobility hub on its way to the park with the cricket kit. And someone said you can't move a sofa without some form of vehicle. You just need to use a skateboard. I've moved the entire contents of a house across a street using a skateboard and a ladder. So resilience in the COVID pandemic is there to be seen. So every small piece of mobility is, in my mind, is a mobility hub. So thank you for that, and we'll hand back to the panel.
Brilliant last slide that. I'd like to have seen the sofa on the skateboard ladder system. But so you really, really interesting and more detailed food for thought. Just picking up on a few of the things that have come up in the chat. People are saying, yes, but we've already got these places. It's our local convenience store. They take all the parcels from ASOS and various other places. How is this different from that? Well, I mean, for a start, it would have to be better organized in my local convenience store, where they're left lying all over the ground and stacked on top of the wheat bix and so on and so forth. So there's a fit for purpose approach, and then there's a tailoring approach, and also expanding it. The convenience store has got pretty limited potential to offer, but I'm sure you could talk some more about that. Are there any other questions, or anyone who's made comments in the chat who would like to throw in a question to Hannah and Gary? Any hands up anywhere, or just shout out? Okay, well, Hannah and Gary, would you like to comment on the potential transformation from, tiny corner post office in the stationery shop or a convenience store with a stack of parcels through to your hub, and what you think needs to happen, and how important is it that we have something dedicated, I suppose?
Well, I would say that the convenience store has always been a hub, and it should always remain. And I agree that because of the pressures of the commercial timescale, that there's not always the ability to make everything so customer friendly or outside of purchasing. And that's why we're seeing it as a sort of, the model for our thinking is a community trust, which has a stake in a convenience store, and thereby uses the benefit, which was once a sort of almost like a gift to the community by the people that own the store. Now it needs to be shared by the community, and they need to work together. So if it would be a place you could drop off goods to be collected, it also needs to be something which people are willing to accept returns, because it's in the benefit of the wider group. And so it's absolutely building on what we always used to think of as the vital hub of the community, but giving everybody a stake. So you like the place you live in because it's part of the infrastructure. And it could be, I mean, we think it could be anything from street furniture to shop to a dedicated building.
That's great. Hannah, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I agree with Gary. I mean, we've kind of very much come at this as a joint approach anyway, so we're on the same lines. Yeah, I think it's just kind of thinking outside the box, isn't it, really? And looking
well, it's thinking inside the box. It's
inside and out.
Redesigning the box.
Yeah, redesigning the box, throwing it away, starting again. No, it's all the, it's all of those parts, and thinking about how we can integrate them rather than just looking at a solution which is probably completely out of date now, and taking the opportunity of all of us in the master planning and urban design industry being able to work on these projects and influence, our clients and our colleagues. And make sure that we actually get some of this thinking, on the ground. I think that's a really important thing.
I must say, I like John Grantham's comment about the transition hubs, and he's raised his hand again, so I'm really pleased. I have a couple of ideas, but if you ask a question first, perhaps, I don't know.
I think Sue was first. I'm just going to give Sue a question.
I don't want to change the direction of the discussion, but I was just thinking that should we involve some other players, like the people who design some of these vehicles? Because I'm not so much deliveries, but looking at waste vehicles. You just look outside in your own house and massive thing that arrives, because it's all been designed to lift the bins up, empty them easily, put them back, leave them in the road, but and move on. It's not so they've kind of fitted their purpose, but they're not fitting our purposes. They're not fitting place purposes. Yeah. Do we have to engage with other people like vehicle designers?
Yes. So I don't know if you caught Robert's introduction at the beginning, but he did cover this ground, and we're through a challenge really to local authorities who commission the vehicles, obviously, or to the waste organisers. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. Gary, did you want to add a comment to that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that it is everything we suggest has to have accept reality that the cost of providing these services is pushing them into larger scale vehicles and so on. And there will be a transition while cost is adjusted to actually deal with the smaller scale. But a bicycle is a lot cheaper than a large waste truck, and so there's got to be something in between where we can actually operate. And with electric powered vehicles, small vehicles down to smaller bicycles, it isn't as easy because you have health and safety issues with waste. But nevertheless, it's feasible, but it's a long time. It will take time to integrate.
Well, the Spanish have small-scale waste vehicles that go through very small streets in medieval cities. So I don't see any reason why we can't redesign them to fit it and be electrically driven as well. So I think that there's definitely a challenge to both local authorities who are commissioning them and the refuse lorry designers, whoever they might be. I haven't ever met one of those. Don't know if
there are. I mean, that was why it's a bit disappointing that. The presentation we had at the beginning, there was a picture of a refuse collection lorry, which was actually a state-of-the-art, quiet, low windscreen, cyclist-friendly refuse collection lorry. And electric will be the norm within a few years of refuse collection vehicles, but the size is very difficult to deal with.
Yes, it's the challenge.
That whenever we vote for whoever says they're going to cut the tax by the most. So there is a significant cost involved if you're going to do lots more delivery, lots more collections in smaller vehicles. Are people prepared to vote for somebody that would?
Well, the opportunity, the option needs to be explained clearly, and that's really I would imagine, a green issue, and if the Green Party or if other progressive parties can actually present what the genuine options are, rather than just saying, I'll carve 10p off your council
option
tax.
is presented. A more green option for waste collection would be fortnightly collections of mainly recycled materials, and whenever councils try to move to fortnightly collections, they almost have a revolution on their hands. In fact, I think the government's moving to make that illegal, even though that could be cheaper and more sustainable. So it's a very sensitive area. I think waste is one of the most difficult things to deal with. But the vacuum collection concept is ideal for new developments, but obviously very difficult to retrofit.
That's true. That's great. I'm just going to take one question from John Grantham, and then we'll move on to the panel, and I'll introduce David Milner then. John, did you have a question?
Yeah, it was really just the same question that I asked Chris and Ian. Have Gary and Hannah considered using residential properties as community logistics hubs? And what are your thoughts on that, and what opportunities and risks are there?
Well, I think I absolutely agree, and I think it came across very memorable to me that in one of the first phases of developing a sort of urban extension semi-new town, one of the requests we received was from the local community leaders to say, can they have a room in the show house to use as a community room? And, you know, it seemed like a no-brainer to me that would be possible, because you build a house to show the potential of a development, and why can't one of the rooms be made available? And then that's extended to the outside space, so you can run some sort of community distribution. It just seems so obvious, because they're saying that so often we're waiting for the building to arrive, which is a community center, a place of worship, but actually all it needs is a room. And I absolutely agree. And I also like the idea of the transition hubs. And my son runs a lot of cycling organizations in the southwest region. And we were speculating what we could do. He lives in Bradford-on-Avon, about how to get more people using bikes in a hilly town. And I said, well, could you have cycling buses where everyone goes shopping or goes to a cafe or goes into town on their bikes, and one person gets the trailer and brings their shopping back home. And then they bring it to their home. Everyone comes, pulls up on their bike, has a cup of coffee, takes their shopping home. So again, it's like the initiative. It may be no more than saying, my home is available for you to pick your shopping up. Once you've bought it, I will, or someone will make sure it gets there, and then you take it home. It's a vital part of the world of spreading this logistics argument into communities, I think. So if it happens in Bradford-on-Avon, you know who's done it.
That's great. That's great. Okay, well, we're continuing the discussion now, and so if everybody who's spoken, and I think we've got Ian and Chris and Gary and Hannah and Roberts somewhere, I hope. And I'm just going to introduce David Milner, who hasn't got a presentation as such. David, would you like to say a few words to start with about your particular subject, bin lorries? Here we are again.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Amanda and Robert, and really enjoyed listening to everyone else, and Chris, Ian, Hannah and Gary. I think just on the bin lorries, I wrote a paper which is called the bin lorry effect. It's the kind of purpose is the butterfly effect, which is, you know, how many small regulations and rules that have sort of crept in, I think, to our street design over 50, 60 years, basically to make it easier to drive and to deliver goods in our towns and cities, have had actually quite large knock-on impacts. So, you know, a small rule which, for example, how many meters the refuse operator can walk with rubbish to a place, that actually, when we're designing places that create streets, that has a huge impact on, you know, can you have permeability? Can you have a long narrow street? Can you tighten the enclosure ratio? All these different things that, if you could make it 15, might suddenly unlock, you know, loads more homes. You know, we're in a housing crisis. So that actually those small rules have a huge knock-on implications. So it was sort of bin lorries, but it's actually about street design and geometry so I'm sort of happy to go through a few of those points. But first, I thought I kind of wanted to respond to the conversation was really interesting we just had on a lot of the solutions to logistics and deliveries and the size of lorries. And I think it's probably worth us not getting too, it's very easy to kind of solutionize, isn't it? And to think of, okay, we could do this solution, we could do that solution. Amazon was brought up, and I don't know if you've noticed, I mean, I'm in Hammersmith, and Amazon's delivery vans, I feel like in about the space of 2 or 3 weeks have all gone electric. Local authorities and Royal Mail and whoever have probably, been talking about this for ages and ages, but overnight, they've adapted to that. And ultimately, rather than sort of thinking about what are the different solutions, if we set in place the regulations or the design of the streets that we want as humans, the logistics, the deliveries, the businesses, multinationals, they will adapt to it. So I do think we need to be a bit sort of stronger on our, belief in what is right for people, and then they will follow. And I'm pretty sure they will have done that because of the ultra low emission zone, which is going to be expanded. Obviously they wouldn't want that, but for their delivery, but they've done it because they need to keep their business model working. So I think that's sort of quite important. And for me personally, it's all about how and why I go into design is all about how we tackle the climate emergency. And this might seem a sort of few orders of magnitude away from it, or a few sort of degrees of relation away from it, but it's actually very very linked to how can you create density in a urban and rural and town environment, but good density that is linked to all the positive well-being, happiness, health aspects as well. So it's that balance of making a place dense but making it not overpowering and not unpleasant, and therefore people want to go and live in towns and cities. And so that's the key thing. And the sort of main effects I'd looked at, it was one on how far you can walk to bin collections. If we can expand, change some of these policies, make it a few more meters, or maybe remove some of those rules, we can start to create much tighter streets. We can add in more homes. We don't need to have as many large turning heads, which will create the need for lots more asphalt, and that's lots more carbon, embodied carbon, and then lots of wasted space which could go into playgrounds and gardens and homes. So that was one of them. And we saw communal bins. I think that's a really interesting topic. I'd love to kind of look into who's designing beautiful communal bins. I think that's important, because otherwise you're going to put some of these in and people will just backlash against them, and then they won't get taken up. So that's important. The design is good, and how can they be retrofitted onto existing streets where maybe you can't go underground, but we need to have communal above surface bins. And then that can help us reduce the need where we do have these larger refuse vehicles for councils that, I've seen some comments on cost cutting. Well, if you keep those to some of the primary streets, because that's where you've got your waste collection points, and we as residents, we take our rubbish to those bins, that's a good solution. So I think that needs to be explored. I think it's, the design of, my sort of second effect on the paper was designing our streets around bin lorries instead of designing the bin lorries around our streets. And I think that's the sort of key with all tech. And I saw some slides with pictures of drones, which slightly scares me. And I'm sure it's a bit sort of cheeky, but we want to design the tech around our streets and around our lives so that it doesn't, maybe we don't even see it, and that should be easier. And that's definitely reversing a trend that we've been adapting our cities to. And the key one will be autonomous vehicles, I imagine, where we'll hear lots coming out from some big consultancies or practices about how we need to kind of get pedestrians out of the road because it's going to affect Tesla's tracking. We need to make sure that doesn't happen. And then some of the other effects was around the impact of highways and impact of guidance like secured by design around where you've got overlooking, regulations asking you to overlook streets with habitable rooms. And this is an overlook parking with habitable rooms based on, crime statistics and behaviours and technologies around maybe in the 60s and 70s. Well, actually now, with that making it's a lot more difficult to steal vehicles, and that those rates I believe have gone down a lot. There's more of a chance to look into peripheral parking again, and how can we balance on street parking with peripheral parking to just reduce the amount of hectares that's used whenever urban designers are creating a place where we can concentrate that, but also concentrate parking and in a place where in 15, 20 years, when transport patterns have moved on, we can now repurpose that into more homes, ideally, or into gardens or parks. So whereas it's very, very hard to repurpose very wide streets with in curtilage parking, it's very hard to do anything more than just have a wide street in the next 100 years. And then maybe I'll just finish. There's a few more effects, but I won't go through them all. But the final one on not so much highways as planning, but looking at parking minimums becoming parking maximums. And I think that's a really, I say easy, I'm sure it's not easy to do, but it could be a really simple change, because the amount of, I think, times you speak with developers or people trying to create places, and they create a lovely place, and then the parking minimum comes in, and even though the developer wants it, and they know that their customer research shows they're only going to use 1.2 cars, but actually they're forced to put in 2 places per household on average, it ends up just breaking a place, and you end up not being able to have good tight streets and sort of having large sort of sways of asphalt. And this doesn't stop rural places from using vehicles, because it's a maximum, so you can just set a high maximum. It just gives freedom to the designers and freedom to developers to actually make better places. So yeah, maybe I'll finish there.
Great, thanks very much, David. You're obviously a very young person. Parking minimums have only recently been brought back in. We used to have parking maximums for most of this century, which is not a huge amount of time, I must admit. And there are plenty of local authorities which are changing back now to parking maximums, which is great, but they need to be pressured to do that more, and let's have some legislation. Autonomous vehicles, yes, huge distraction. They're looming as a big problem. And the communal waste bin thing is another issue that people have talked about, but requires a whole lot of behaviours that people don't seem to be very good at. However, that's great. Final quick presentation. Very happy to take other questions from people on these various points. I mean, we've covered a huge range of topics in the urban design lexicon. There's been quite a bit of activity going on the chat, which I haven't had a chance to read all of it. So maybe some of the people contributing, Graham Smith, I think you threw something into the chat which I didn't see. Would you like to tell us all what you were talking about, or ask the panel for a bit of clarification, run something past the panel for their consideration?
It was about the logistics of shopping, and was it David just now talking about somebody agreeing to bring back the shopping, and I wonder if the panel know that in Denmark, or at least in Copenhagen, to the best of my knowledge, it's obligatory that taxis all carry a couple of hooks in their boot and a couple of holes in the rear bumper, so that you can call a cab from a supermarket, load your 20 bags into the back of the taxi, stick your bike on the back, and be carried home. I saw it. I haven't been to the Denmark that many times, but I've noticed it on a number of occasions. I think the first time I ever noticed it was to see a woman in slow-moving traffic surrounded by shopping bags and trying to work out what was going on. And slowly it dawned on me. It's individually focused as well, isn't it? As opposed to having to, not that I'm against agreeing with half a dozen other people to do something like that, but I think having cabs which already exist with that kind of demand laid upon them by the licensing authority or something could make a huge difference to shopping by bike. Full stop.
Graham, you do know that London black cabs are legally obliged to take bikes inside them, and they are sized to accommodate a bicycle.
Yes, but London's a small place down the road. It doesn't matter for the rest of the country.
Sorry, where you go, David. Would you like to comment on that, and anyone else from the panel like to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm happy. I'm not. I don't know if it was someone else who was talking about shopping, but I think it's
I think it was
linked.
John.
Yeah, I'm happy to sort of respond just on. You know, I think this is another. I mean, why do people in Copenhagen cycle? It's not that they're all, much more virtuous than everyone who's on this call or whatever reason. It's because it's cheap and it's bloody quick to get from A to B by bike, whereas by car, the way they've designed their I'm talking about Copenhagen, but in some of their towns, they've designed their towns and cities so that it's you can go through very easily by sustainable means. You have to go round by vehicle, and until we make it far quicker, more pleasant, more enjoyable to walk and to cycle and to take public transport to the shop, that we're not going to need to have bike racks on taxis, because people will have enough parking spaces and be able to drive a Porsche Cayenne to pick up the shopping and then back. Whereas if it's actually you have that carrot and stick where it's maybe a bit more tricky, because your car is actually a few streets away in the the peripheral parking hub, or you don't have one because the public transport it's a bit further away, and actually you've got a really pleasant, safe cycle route. That's the end. That's when we'll those problems will be solved by the market and by entrepreneurial people out there creating the solutions. But until we give them the streets that this is an option to choose, no one's going to do it. I don't think. Well, fewer people do.
That's great, thank you. Any other contributions from the panel about the Robert? Where you go?
I was wondering. We've had some fantastic visionary ideas. How do we get these implemented? In particular, we've got the National Planning Policy Framework, the National Model Design Code, and also Manual for Streets currently being revised. May I ask the other panelists how we can move forward on the policy and guidance front, and then perhaps also as a second question, how to get developers persuaded to advocate this approach too.
Can I jump in? I think I'm not going to be an expert on the policy side of things, but we certainly are working with developers and clients who are already really excited and interested about exploring this, which is so great to see. So I think those of us that have that opportunity, we need to kind of grab the ball by the horns and kind of get some of this actually happening on the ground, and that's what we will be continuing to do. Fingers crossed.
Great. Thanks, Hannah. Anyone else? Chris? Yeah.
I was just going to say that, over the year, 27 years in the industry, and the last 17 in consultancy work, looking at urban freight management measures, the best thing you can do is try it. Build a consortium, put a bit of collaboration, a bit of partnership between public and private sector, find a decent site, and then just trial it. And that's been the case. Ian talked about retiming delivery activities, come up a few times in the chat as well. And there's a lot of demonstration trials on retiming delivery activity outside of daytime peak periods that really did show that you could do it, and it would save not just free up road space and avoid congestion, improve local amenity, and also minimize conflict with other vulnerable road users, but also was efficient from a business point of view. So I think the step in my view, there's a parallel process, try to get policy changed or amended to incorporate it, but also then demonstrate its impact.
I think that's a very good point. I'd like to add as well that in terms of from a design point of view, I think those of us that work on town centre high street regeneration and new settlement design, we need to start putting community hubs. We're just working on a new master plan where we've got what we're calling a community and parking hub, because we're trying to peripheralize, if I can invent a horrible verb, peripheralize parking so that every site doesn't have loads of parking on site, pull the traffic movements away. And it's a strategic master plan, but we've identified locations where there'll be community and parking hubs, and just listed the activities those can have. Now, when they when it comes to be built, someone's going to interpret that in some way. It hasn't got any particular physical design at all in the design code, so it'll be a commercial stroke mixed use building. But we feel by putting these words and putting the labels on the drawings and embedding them into the process, so they become, the concept becomes normalized, I suppose. And if we keep talking about it, it's got to trickle through the local authorities and into developers as well. So developers look at these things and go, well, what's that? Why do I have to provide that? I just want to whack up a load of houses. Well, I'm sorry, you can't do that because you're not actually permitted to put all the parking in there. So you've got to think about how you're going to deal with that and how you can then bring the mix of uses in. So I think that's incumbent upon us at the design end. And yes, great. If as Chris has just explained, talking about a demonstrator project, that's excellent.
John, can I add one thing?
David, yes,
sorry,
sure.
I don't want to jump in. Sorry.
No, well, no, you're the panel. You're meant to be.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So on that one, so I've scribbled down 5 thoughts. So I guess. So I think we need to sort of get to real sort of things you can action. I feel like the vision is there and everyone sort of, a lot of people in urban design are on board with it, but so I think one would be, manual for streets to be actually adopted as policy. So it's not guidance and you don't have as many people who actually don't even know about it, or, they haven't burnt DMR and DB32. Then things such as DMRB, where you've got the design of design manual for roads and bridges, actually still being used in town centres and still being used in places where people live. And I think it's to see that guidance where it is needed in the current world we live in, to link places, but not to be used for roads and infrastructure where people are actually living. And to actually expand that, almost the catchment of manual for streets. I think that's quite crucial and something that I haven't heard too much being talked about. There's definitely some updates to the MPPF in terms of parking maximums and minimums, which I think we've spoken about. And then on design codes and the National Model Design Code, I think there's a real opportunity for scaling change quite rapidly. And quite excitingly, I was on a webinar with Dr. Gary Fuller and a couple of us on air pollution, and we're talking about clean air zones and talking about air pollution, mitigation, such as stopping wood burning stoves and clean air standards. Well, why don't we link the area types? If people are familiar with the National Model Design Code, has area types for high streets and urban environments and suburban, and they categorise them quite nicely, actually. Why don't we link air pollution interventions to these area types? So when you do have a new place coded as this, or an existing place designated as whatever, it brings with it improvements and some of these things we've spoken about, 20-mile-an-hour zones. Why don't we, by any area type that's designated as that, become a 20-mile-an-hour zone, which is a thought. And then my final sort of plea or thought is, when we're dealing with projects that bring with them big infrastructure, relief roads, whatever, is to try and shift away from some of the older school traffic models and go much more to principles and designing for the traffic that we want, rather than the projected demand, which is just sort of going to give you that cycle of more and more road infrastructure and then more and more vehicles, and making it easier to do that. So, and then to stop seeing traffic models as a finite, a definite science, because they're not. They're based on assumptions.
Great, excellent. Now, John, you have another question or comment to make?
Well, it was sort of prompted by something in the comments from Stephen Bate, who said, "You're right, Robert. Implementation is the key, and persuading the general public to make sustainable changes is a mammoth task." That interested me, because the transition hub concept, I think, has the potential to be a grassroots catalyst for change, because the hub network is driven by the people who are passionate about sustainability. So recruiting volunteers to then engage with their neighbours is an antidote to polarisation, because of the things like social media bubbles and all the other people's social networks tend to be built on affiliations and common interest, whereas the neighbourhood hub concept is building on the common bond of neighbourhood. So it there's the potential there to include everyone, and sort of overcome those sort of social barriers and build a more cohesive community. So yeah, I think, yeah, it does need top-down leads and everything, but there's also this potential at a grassroots level, using the people that are passionate about transition and sustainability, can create these networks from the ground up. So it's a comment really rather than a question.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, we're coming close to the end. We've got another couple of minutes to go. I don't see any other hands up, but maybe someone from the panel would like to make any final remarks before we close the event for the day. Anyone? You've felt like you've said the lot. Well, that's fantastic.
I could just basically,
Great, Gary.
I can totally endorse what you've said, is that we as designers of new settlements and urban areas should start making these as a presume we're going to persuade people and put them in our schemes 100%.
Yeah.
I'm behind you 100%.
Great. Well, we're charged with second guessing the future. I mean, a 25-year master plan. Well, what the hell's it going to look like in 25 years? Who knows? But we've got to start by at least making suggestions of these new types of uses and functions that will happen in our urban blocks and buildings. So we put the words in, draw the little block, and we'll see what happens.
Yep.
So thanks, Gary and Hannah. Thanks, David. Thanks, Ian and Chris. And thanks, Robert. Even if you did pick a very green rubbish truck to show us, it was still a monster, along with all those Hummers and things. Thanks very much to everybody for all this, really informative. And it is really great to see the detailed thinking that's going on in this stuff, because I have to say that for all having it, thinking it's a great idea and putting it on the drawing, I hadn't thought through the details. So if you don't mind, I'll start pinching bits for the next drawings. I think we've all got to cross fertilize and embed these things in our projects and bring the future forward to as soon as possible. So thanks again for all your presentations and appearing, and thanks to particularly John Grantham and Sue James, who were the most enthusiastic questioners and commenters. Thanks very much to Martin Ryan, I think it was, from Cork. And there is in the chat, I think there's people have been putting a few links to other things to look at. So if you want to follow up all these various things, do follow the links.